On 6. Check 1, 2.
1, 2, 1.
All right, as Jason makes his way up, let me introduce the next panel, Venezuela, What to Do. And it's going to be moderated by Jason Marczak, director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin American Center at the Atlantic Council. Then Elliott Abrams, back for the third time, I must say, in a different capacity this time. Special representative for Venezuela at the U.S. State Department. Astrid Arraras, the lecturer and associate director, undergraduate studies, Department of Politics and International Relations at FIU. Then Brian Fonseca, the director, Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy and adjunct professor, Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. Frank Mora, professor and director, Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center at FIU. And last but not least, Luis Guillermo Solis Rivera, professor, Department of Politics and International Relations at FIU and former president of Costa Rica. Jason, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, David. And first of all, congratulations to you, FIU, on this incredible gathering. President Rosenberg as well. This is truly first in class, so congratulations. We're holding this discussion today on January 10th, 2020, 1 year exactly since Nicolas Maduro assumed a second term, illegitimate, fraudulently elected second term in office. We're also holding this discussion 5 days since Nicolas Maduro tried to block the National Assembly, the democratically elected National Assembly, from electing its own president. We're also holding this 2 weeks before the interim government marks 1 year in power, and nearly 2 weeks before Special Representative Abrams, you mark a year as Special Representative. And also 2 weeks since the first country in the world, Paraguay, recognized that interim government. But I think also despite the euphoria among some that a change would be quick, of course it hasn't been. And also, if you look at Venezuelan history, it would have predicted that that change would not have been quick. Look at 2007, the student protests of 2007 when the government sought to first, under Hugo Chavez, shut down one of the prominent media companies in the country. This is a long time in the making. There is a lot to talk about over the course of this panel. And I have 5 distinguished panelists, of which I'm going to give very hard questions. I've also always liked panels to disagree with each other, so please do feel free to disagree with each other over the course of this panel. What we're going to discuss in the next 45 minutes is a couple of things. We're going to look at the political scenarios within Venezuela in 2020. We'll look at U.S. priorities to advance the transition. The role of foreign actors, incredibly important in supporting Maduro, and also new steps that can be taken both domestically and externally to place additional pressure on Nicolas Maduro. So first, let's start off by looking at diagnosing what's happening, looking at some of the motivations, some of the drivers. Special Representative Abrams, no surprise, the first question is to you. That's just because you happen to be seated to my right. But this past week marked a foiled attempt by the Maduro regime to install its preferred candidate as head of the National Assembly. Today, as I mentioned, Juan Guaido remains head of that body. So, Special Representative Abrams, why did that plan backfire?
I think this was a move of desperation by the regime. We had anticipated that there'd be a very close vote. And as you know, over the last, let's say, 2 months, there has been an effort to intimidate deputies, to jail deputies, to exile deputies, to bribe deputies. And so what Juan Guaido and the opposition were doing was vote counting. Obviously, the regime reached the conclusion it didn't work. They could not intimidate enough people or bribe enough people. And when they did their vote counting over the weekend, they saw they would lose. And obviously, they were not prepared for that to happen. So they did something they had not done before and whose international repercussions were reasonably predictable. Denunciations, very strong denunciation by the EU, statement by the EU Foreign Minister Borrell yesterday, and immediate denunciations by 2 left-of-center governments, Argentina and Mexico. So it boomeranged because I think they did something they really, in a certain sense, didn't plan to do or want to do initially. They didn't want to have to use strong arm tactics, but the opposition was sufficiently strong and unified so that they had to.
Borrell's statement specifically yesterday called the actions, quote, totally unacceptable, end quote.
And mentioned sanctions.
And mentioned sanctions. And actually, on that point, a quick follow-up question to you before going to others on the panel. Much discussion this week on possible additional U.S. sanctions with regard to those who backed this Maduro plan. So if you could explain a little bit more about potential additional actions that U.S. might consider to levy additional pressure on those who sought to illegally push Juan Guaido from power as head of the National Assembly.
Well, just very briefly, I'm always amused by being asked by the press, now you're out of sanctions. You have no more you can do. And of course, that's wrong. There will be additional sanctions next week. And that's a beginning, and we are studying other ways to bring more pressure on the regime. But the thing that would help in a way most is international solidarity here, taking a word from the previous panel. This is one of the things that we hope to see happen under the TIAR, the Rio Treaty. And I was, of course, very pleased to see High Commissioner Borrell say it, because we need more European personal sanctions so that Europe cannot be a kind of playground for people in the regime.
Just one quick on these additional sanctions that will come out next week. Can you give any more?
No.
No. Okay. I would not be doing my job if I didn't ask you that follow-up question. Yeah. President Solis, what's your biggest concern for the region as you look at the consequences of Maduro staying in power, especially some of the illegality that has been perpetuated by the regime?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Dean Stack, David, and all of you who have come to this very important activity. Well, first and foremost, my biggest concern is humanitarian. Obviously, the suffering of the people of Venezuela is unbearable. Millions of them have been displaced. People within Venezuela are currently starving. They don't have medicine. So I think we should not forget that at the center of this problem, we have people with names, with families, people who suffer, and that's my biggest concern. Secondly, I'm really worried about the bad example that Venezuela has turned into being within the hemisphere. We have similar situations happening in Nicaragua, for example. We had the situation, obviously, in Bolivia that's now fortunately taking a different course. But it's the fact that the activities of the regime in Venezuela are now mixed with crime, for example. Foreign intervention, extracontinental intervention, particularly from China and Russia. Something that we're looking in other places. And allow me to make a footnote here. Somebody mentioned Nicaragua yesterday. I think we should bring it back. It's an issue. It's probably as serious or more serious in terms of the things that have happened if you take the proportion of the size of the country, the amount of people who have been killed by the regime, the amount of people who have been displaced, the impact Nicaragua has had in Costa Rica, my country, in terms of displaced people. Over almost 80,000 Nicaraguans have been went to Costa Rica running away from the situation in Nicaragua, and then Russia. And everybody's talking about China. What about Russia and Nicaragua? They have refurbished the Nicaraguan armed forces. They have an academy that's an active academy there for their armed forces. They have radars and information centers just at the outskirts of Nicaragua, and that seems not to be an issue. Well, I think it is an issue. So, a bad example. And then, thirdly, I think it has put the international community in a very difficult position because we have to have success in Venezuela. Otherwise, defending democracy elsewhere is going to become a very big problem. I mean, we're seeing things in Latin America which have a different origin than what we've seen in Venezuela, but we've seen people very unhappy with democratic institutions and democratic results in Colombia, in Chile, in Ecuador, and I don't think we can blame Venezuela and Cuba for all of that. Maybe some of it, but not all of that. And we have to be very careful because we don't want to go that way, and we should not allow this to be a successful way. And I think part of what we're discussing here is how do we contribute so that the results in Venezuela are what we want, a democracy.
And President Solis, I want to get a little bit more into the role of Russia, foreign actors. In many ways, what we're seeing in Venezuela is global geopolitical competition playing out right here in our hemisphere. And I think the question is who's going to win? Are the Russians and the Chinese, or is it going to be democracies that are going to win in this? And I think also importantly on your point on the humanitarian, importantly the Verdad Act that passed in December as part of the larger appropriations bill. Senator Rubio was incredibly important for that, as were both House colleagues, both the Democrats and Republicans from Florida. That provides $400 million in additional humanitarian aid and economic assistance. So a far uptick in what we've been providing.
Yeah, Senator Menendez was also very much
Senator
involved
Menendez
in that.
sponsored that.
And then we should also say that there are evolutions. The second report of Madame Bachelet, Michelle Bachelet's report, I think, was very encouraging as well, because she points out new issues that should be taken into account.
Astrid, I want to go to you. Special Representative Abrams was talking about the number of countries that came out forcefully against the actions taken by the Maduro regime. The EU High Representative, the International Contact Group, yesterday also put out a statement recognizing the horrific acts that the Maduro regime took. But also, Argentina, new government, Felipe Solá, the foreign minister, came out with a pretty strong statement, as did Mexico and others, and of course, the United States and the Lima Group. What additional cards do regional democracies have to support a democratic transition? What statements are one thing, but statements don't result in action always. So what additional cards do you see as critical?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here today. One point of clarification about Argentina's foreign policy or reaction to the recent events. Argentina had another president, President Macri, who recognized Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela. There's a new administration, a new government since December 10th. This new government has opposed the recent events of blocking the entrance of Guaido into the National Assembly, electing another president of the assembly without the presence of the opposition. And the foreign minister of this new administration, he has sent a message saying, we oppose what happened, and this is a warning that Maduro could be isolated internationally if he continues with this path. However, on Tuesday, the new administration sent a letter to the ambassador or representative of Guaido in Argentina, revoking her credentials as a representative of the Guaido government. So we have to be very careful about Argentina's position. It's not necessarily endorsing, supporting Guaido, defending Guaido. So we have to be very careful about that.
Very good point.
Yes, thank you. And regarding what options regional democracies have in the region, I always encourage countries to use soft powers, to use international forums to raise awareness about the issues in Venezuela, about the blatant dismantling of democratic institutions in Venezuela, violations of human rights. You should never underestimate the power of diplomatic path or resources. So I encourage all these Latin American democracies to continue creating awareness, consciousness, and denouncing the blatant destruction of democratic institutions and practices in Venezuela.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Astrid. Frank, I want to, President Solis brought up Russia, and it's the role of Russia is pivotal, absolutely pivotal in keeping Nicolas Maduro in power. And my question to you is, what do you see as the extent to which foreign countries, especially Russia, will go to keep him in power? Where does that end? Is there any end with the degree to which Russia will work to keep him in power?
Not at the moment. I think the Russians see Venezuela as an opportunity, a geopolitical strategic opportunity to keep sort of pointing the finger in the eye of the United States and undermining U.S. interests, not just in the region, but in other places. So I think Russia will continue finding ways of helping the Venezuelans bypass the sanctions that have been imposed. as other countries, the Turks have done as well. But let me, Jason, if I may, just sort of stay just a minute on this question of sanctions that Elliott mentioned, because I think, it may not be true, but certainly the perception of the administration's policy is as basically sanctions focused. That there isn't much beyond that other than trying to get other nations to join in the effort. And I think we've reached a point of diminishing returns on the sanctions policy. And let me explain what I mean by that. I think there's a point that, what is the regime's sort of bottom line to survive? What does it need to just muddle through, not to make things better or anything, but to just sustain the coalition of the dictatorship, right? What does that look like? I don't have an answer for that, by the way. And then what is it that the regime or the dictatorship receives from illicit activities, right? If the delta is this, then the regime really is in trouble. But if the delta is this, they can muddle through and sustain themselves with illicit activities and Russia's help in bypassing the sanctions. So my question then will become, so what's the purpose of sanctions? What's the objective of sanctions? Because I think Elliott's right, I think there's more sanctions to be done, but those sanctions are going to start having a real impact on the Venezuelan people. So what's the objective of the sanctions when you have so many different ways in which the dictatorship can bypass or compensate for the pain from sanctions?
Elliott, let me give you a chance to respond to that.
Well, we don't have a sanctions policy. We have a policy of promoting a return to democracy in Venezuela. And it's obvious that the regime doesn't want to do that, so they need to be pressured into it. And sanctions, particularly international sanctions, are probably the most effective way of doing that. I do think there is more to be done on sanctions because they really are reliant on outside forces. The pillars of this regime's support now are Cuba and Russia. It would not be surviving. China less so, but if, for example, there were a different Russian policy toward Venezuela, I don't think the regime would last very long. I agree that that calculation is an important calculation, but if you look at the production levels for oil, and that's what we're talking about, they're not getting any money from Russia anymore. That's the important thing. There were loans. They're being paid off. Russia is actually extracting money from Venezuela, not putting money in. No new loans, no new investments. So I think the level of Russian commitment now is, in a way, diminishing, and I think that the regime is relying on oil production, not loans, not investments, and the level of oil production continues to decline. So actually it's going to, I think, be having a tougher time surviving than it had in the last year or two or three.
But on Sunday, Russia was the first and actually I think the only country to come out so forcefully in support of the illegal actions that Maduro took to.
It was, but it did not simultaneously announce, and given this view, here's $1 billion loan. It did not say that.
Very important point. Frank, let me go back to you. Then I'm going to go to Brian on a Cuba question, so get ready, Brian.
Well, I don't want to make this a debate between myself and
but let me go back to you, Frank, on Russia and how you see the extent to which Russia is going to work to keep Maduro in power.
I think, listen, Russia's in the business of also extracting whatever it can from Venezuela, while at the same time trying to prop up the dictatorship. They're making their own calculations, but they're not going to pull the plug. And I'm trying to think of scenarios under which the Venezuelans or the Cubans or others like that could say to the regime, dictatorship, we're done with you. We're going to bail out, because there's, the dictatorship keeps doing things that you would expect others to, or at least the Russians to pull, but they're not, because this for them is just more than just extracting resources. This is part of the geopolitical game that they're playing. So I just don't see a scenario under which Russians will pull out. And people have talked, well, we should be sanctioning Russia. I'm not sure this administration will be sanctioning Russia further than it has. And I'm not sure that will be productive in trying to get the Russians to be helpful in Venezuela. So I just don't, in my mind, I don't see the Russians or the Cubans or even the Turks playing less of a role than they've played in the last year.
Maybe the one thing that would potentially switch Russian position is right now for Vladimir Putin, this is a PR win back home. And when Russia's support of the Maduro regime no longer helps him at home domestically, especially given the state of the Russian economy, that could potentially, a domestic issue, potentially shift that focus. Let me switch to you. Brian, you want to comment on Russia before I go to you on Cuba?
I know we're going to talk about Cuba in just a minute, but it is important to truly assess the role of Russia. I mean, I get sort of the spirit of sanctioning, but as long as there are pressure release valves, economic pressure release valves, which is what Russia's been playing, Russia, China have been playing important pressure release valves to help bypass sanctions, then the sanctions are going to have far less teeth. And so it's sort of it's a really difficult position because yes, the sanctions could have a greater impact, but that means that you're going to have to reduce that pressure release valve that is in the form of China, Russia, which are really important players. And so if the idea is to apply serious international and economic, diplomatic, or international economic and diplomatic pressure, then you've got to have all of the big players in the country on the same team. If not, then you're essentially giving exit, a pretty easy off-ramp, not easy, but you have an off-ramp for the regime, and that's what we're seeing. Yeah. And that's why that initial, pressure, in January of 2019 was less effective because ultimately that pressure release valve essentially manifested in the form of China, Russia, Turkey, and others. So I think that's really important. So now we're going to go to more of the tactical, which is
and Brian, I promised you being here in Miami, I give you a tough question, which is the Cuba question. Lincoln Diaz-Balart in the last panel said I think Cubans will not allow Maduro to turn over power, is what Lincoln said. My question for you is, as was discussed in that last panel as well, Cuban support, both intelligence support, security support has been critical for sustaining the regime. We've talked about that in this panel as well. I'm going to give you a question where it's very difficult to have an answer here, but what do you see as the pressure points or incentives that could potentially get the Cubans to rethink their calculation and switch their bet from Nicolas Maduro?
So you told me you were going to ask that question, and I said, if you ask that question, I'm going to give it to Frank. I'm not going to take it. No, it's a tough question. There's no doubt, and Maria and others brought it up on the last panel, that Cuba plays a very important role in firewalling the regime. And I think this is very tactical. I mean, at the end of the day, in the context of security and intelligence, whether you're talking about 25,000, right, which is what the administration and others have put out, which is highly unlikely, or you're talking about just a few thousand, the size of the Cuban role in Venezuela is far less important than the role that they're playing, which is to provide that sort of internal firewall to keep the regime in place. And I think there's some merit to thinking about the pressure that Cuba's been putting on Maduro to stay in power. I've heard the same rumors with Russia also saying, Maduro, you're to stay stay in place. But ultimately, those are the nations that have been supporting and propping up, in my opinion, helping Maduro weather the storm, which I think, in my assessment, Maduro's he perhaps feels he's in a far better place than he is today than he was on January 23rd, the day before Guaido took over, last year, because they feel they've weathered, the storm. They've consolidated some of those relationships, Cuba, Russia, and China particularly. But in terms of, how do we, think about, exploiting the Cuban role in an effort to see, some type of regime change, or at minimum, because the goalpost somewhat changes. It's restoration of democracy, and then it's regime change, then it's let's just get Maduro out of there. And I think that, sort of lends to, the struggle that we're having in terms of, exacting against the, the policy interests that we have as the United States. But there are two approaches, right? It's punitive or it's, incentive. How do you punish Cuba enough that they're willing to withdraw their support? And on the other side, it's how do you inspire them enough? And I don't have a good answer for the question because I think it's really difficult. I think that the regime has tied to some degree, the Cuban regime has tied to some degree its survival to the Venezuelans. And inversely, the Venezuelans have tied their survival to some degree to the Cubans. That's a very difficult thing to break, particularly, with the people you have in power in both countries today. So I don't see, from a U.S. strategy perspective, either. I mean, look, we've been levying punitive, efforts against Cuba now for quite a few decades, and none of it has really manifested in the kind of outcome that we wanted. So I'm not sure the punitive is going to continue to work, especially if you have these off-ramps that seem to be used. At the same time, I'm not sure, particularly in the administration that has claimed to undo some of the incentives that it was giving Cuba in terms of trying to move Cuba in a different direction. I'm not sure that those incentives will be put back on the table either. So I don't see a change in that status quo, at least in the current context.
Others want to jump in. I'm going to go back to you on another question, Special Representative Abrams, but others want to jump in on that easy Cuba question. Special Abrams, so today, as I mentioned in the beginning, marks 1 year since Nicolas Maduro assumed a term in office that's widely viewed as fraudulent. As many of you saw in the audience yesterday, Secretary Pompeo came out with a statement that clarified the U.S. position and said, for those who haven't read the Secretary's statement, said that a negotiated transition to democracy is the most effective and sustainable route to peace and prosperity, and also called for parliamentary and presidential elections in 2020. Elliott, if you could explain a little bit more the background behind that statement. Also, what does a statement, and there's also an accompanying fact sheet on what constitutes a free and fair election. What does that statement and the accompanying fact sheet mean in practice?
Pardon me. Well, we wanted to clarify what we're doing because we've heard many times that you don't really have a policy except sanctions. So this is a description of what our policy toward Venezuela is. The only way out of the current crisis is a presidential election. National Assembly elections are scheduled this year. That doesn't solve the crisis. The crisis is solved by a presidential election. It has to be a free election. What does that mean? I think we all pretty much know what it means, but we set out in the fact sheet the kinds of things we're talking about. All parties allowed to run, exiled deputies being allowed to come home, an end of censorship, lots of international observers, and fair vote counting. The normal list. Now, can we count on Nicolas Maduro to cooperate and hold such a free election? No. And if we didn't know that, we saw more on Sunday. Therefore, we will need a transitional government. Why? Because only it could be trusted to hold a free election. And a free election, again, is not an event that happens on one day. It is a process. There has to be a free campaign so that Venezuelans really can choose their president. So that's really what we laid out. And if you look at the statements from the EU and from Borrell, it's really the same thing. Borrell said also, we need to see free and fair presidential elections in Venezuela. That's the way out. Now, how do you get there? It's obvious, I would have thought, that they're not going to fall from the sky. There's going to have to be a negotiation about the conditions. Yeah. So that's really what the statement and the fact sheet said yesterday. That's how we see Venezuela emerging from this crisis.
And from your perspective, how do we get to that point? As you said, it won't just fall from the sky. So how do we actually get to the point where there is the desire to have a negotiation on free and fair elections? And I think the fact sheet the statement said that the former Maduro regime, and so it said that a transitional government must be in place before those elections even occur. So how do we
because we don't trust Maduro to preside over free elections. I mean, the last presidential election was May 2018, over which he presided, and it was not a free and fair election. How do we get there? International solidarity, EU sanctions, Rio Treaty member state sanctions of various kinds, lifting visas, travel restrictions, more American sanctions, unity on the part of the opposition in Venezuela, and that was very striking last week. Guaido had 100 votes, which meant that a lot of the people in the opposition who are not Guaido supporters said, well, I'm voting for him in this context because we all have to stay together. And actions that Guaido has called for some this weekend on the part of the Venezuelan people, of course, showing what they want. Those all have to come together because the regime, for obvious reasons, doesn't want free elections. It's going to have to be pushed into free elections.
President Solis, on Special Representative's point on how do we get there, the sanctions, international solidarity, pressure points. What do you see as the most effective international pressure that could be placed on the regime?
Well, I largely agree with the Special Representative's perspective. I think everything has to come at the same time. This is a big problem because we don't have too much time, so everything has to come out at the same time. I was encouraged by the declaration of Mr. Borrell. I think it was a very important change in the position of the European Union to take a more active and coordinated way. Talking with all the parties involved is very important. Coordinating more with the European Union is something that we should look at. Get the Lima Group and the other groups in Latin America to participate in this coordination is important. I'm somehow troubled by the divisions that continue to exist within the opposition. I mean, yes, they voted for Guaido, but that was a very specific thing at the National Assembly after an egregious violation of all decent politics on the part of the Maduro regime. But the fractures are still there. They're open. They have not been hidden. This has been a problem in Venezuela. It continues. It's been challenged in Nicaragua. They're doing a different approach, which I welcome. But in Venezuela, I still have that issue. And then, you know, one thing that I would hope would happen is that the Venezuelan people will continue to mobilize. And this, I know, is easy to say in Miami in an academic context, not putting your life on the line. But this is not going to be solved only with, you know, international cooperation. No. It requires sacrifices, more sacrifices, yes, and big ones from the population in Caracas and elsewhere. And given the conditions of repression in Venezuela, this is not something that's not going to be easy, nor should be recommended because it's going to be costly, and it could be costly in human lives. The regime has proven that it doesn't respect human life at all. But I think that that's another front that needs to be articulated. Otherwise, everything that's done abroad is going to be limited.
You know, I want to just throw thank you, President. I want to throw one of your statements back to the panel. I've actually seen comparatively, historically, with regard to the last year in Venezuela versus where we've been for the last decade, significant unity among democratic forces, especially compared to where we had seen that in the past. And I actually use the word democratic forces rather than opposition because there's the interim government, but then there's also everybody outside of the political sphere. There's civil society, there's educators, there's the average person on the street. So kind of throwing it back to the panel, do others also agree on the state of unity among democratic forces, or do others see kind of more unity than where we've been in the past? Yeah, Frank.
So, you know, I agree with the president on this one, Jason. I think up until maybe the example that we just had a few days ago, the opposition over a period of time has been more at war with itself than with the Maduro dictatorship. We saw the whole issue of the corruption. Guaido's polling numbers had been declining. You know, you get a sense that there was frustration of a lack of movement, and they started going after each other. And it's worth repeating something that the president said, and that is, if you do a comparative study of history of democratic transitions, it's democratic forces within the country that take the lead in change. External actors have a role. Solidarity is important. Pressure is important, but at the end of the day, it is secondary. It is sort of a domestic national process that has to occur. And up until the president's comments, we've been talking about external factors and external agents. And the start of that process has to be, you know, not total unanimity within democratic forces, but there has got to be a consensus about strategies and best ways ahead between the leadership, civil society, et cetera. And frankly, I have not seen that. In fact, I've seen that eroded. So we can talk all about the Russians and the Cubans, and absolutely those things are important. Right. And whatever the external community can do to put pressure on the dictatorship, absolutely. But if that's not done in the context of some real work in the domestic phase, that's going to be for naught. And if I may, Jason, just to go back to your question to Elliott, because I just want to be want to be clear here. So the Secretary of State said that the way out in Venezuela is a negotiated democratic transition and election, right? Elliott said that is true, but that's not likely to happen because the Maduro regime is not likely to negotiate that. So then what is the policy? What is the strategy? Is the strategy then to seek a negotiation with the dictatorship? Or is it simply to say they are not willing to move forward, therefore we're going to continue doing what we've done in the past, which is basically sanctions focused? So just for clarity purposes.
Let me give that back to you.
I don't see the lack of clarity. We have said what we think is the path out for Venezuela. And in it, we are joined with basically every democracy in Latin America and the European Union, which is a negotiation leading to a presidential election. Now, we saw in the Oslo talks last year that the regime was not prepared to negotiate seriously. Until it is prepared to negotiate seriously, the pressures will remain. If it wants to relieve the pressure, and it does, we know that it wants the sanctions lifted, it's going to have to engage seriously
In negotiation.
and go to a presidential election. And we've said many times the sanctions are lifted after Maduro leaves power. And now you could say, well, what if he wins a free election? And my answer to that is kind of like the last panel. I mean, in my experience, people who think they can win a free election hold a free election. They're not afraid of it. These guys are scared to death because they read the same opinion polls that I read. Maduro has about 10 or 12% support.
But so sanctions is going to get them finally to agree to a negotiation.
That is the goal of sanctions. The goal of sanctions is to get to a negotiation that leads to a free presidential election. Because National Assembly elections don't get Venezuela
Is there any
out
evidence
of
of
the
that?
crisis.
Is there any evidence is there any evidence that the regime is responding or weakening in its response?
Well, tell me why they actually engaged, I would say, in the Oslo talks. In my view, that was a sign of weakness on part of the regime. They wanted to get the pressure off. So I think if we maintain, and not only maintain, with a growing international coalition, we didn't have the TR a year ago. We didn't have this EU position a year ago. With growing American sanctions, I think we increase the international pressure until the point, and I agree entirely, the Venezuelan people have to be in the lead here, until the point at which the regime is forced back to the table. But this time, seriously, which they weren't last time.
And I think a very important point that both of you bring up is, and we can have this, don't worry, after this panel ends, there'll be probably plenty of time for Q&A from the audience. So, but the importance of the solution has to come from the Venezuelan people. And the role of the United States, the role of the role of the Lima Group and others is to support the will of the Venezuelan people. And how can we best support the will of the Venezuelan people? I also disagree. I've also seen much more unity among democratic forces over the course of the last year, working across political lines to try to, with their Plan País and other programs of the interim government. But Astrid, on the topic of regional, we're talking about unity within Venezuela, but also there's the important point of unity across the region as well. You made the point in your last comment about the change in government in Argentina with Alberto Fernandez as president. How do we keep regional unity, and how do we also keep regional momentum to confront Maduro? In some ways, there's also the important point of regional unity with regard to the Venezuelan migrants and refugees. We have countries that were originally very welcoming to Venezuelans. The welcome mat was quickly pulled out from beneath them. And this year, as we look at UN estimates, I would say close to 7 million, 6.5 million total Venezuelan migrants and refugees across the hemisphere. This is a significant, cannot be underestimated, the significant strain this places on, in particular, Colombia, as Colombia is working to implement a peace accord and has a number of other challenges. How do we keep that regional unity and momentum?
Yes, that's a big challenge. Just making another comment about another change of government. It happened in Uruguay. It's an incoming government, and this incoming government won't be as neutral, I think, as the previous administration of the brought from the Frente Amplio. I think the new administration might be more in favor of Guaidó. But going back to your question about regional unity and the challenge of the refugees, as you mentioned, different Latin American countries have been host countries for all these refugees. The largest amount of refugees are located in Colombia. I have here the number, it's 1.3 million refugees in Colombia. Peru has also hosted, Ecuador, Brazil, Argentina, there are many, and some islands from the Caribbean. This creates tremendous pressure on these countries that are willing to help the refugees. It's too much to ask all these countries to provide shelter, food, educational services, health services to all these refugees. It creates tremendous pressure on them, and they're willing to do it because they either support the cause of the Venezuelans, they want to help the refugees. But what can be done to help these countries? I think there has to be, the international community has to step up even more. It has. The United Nations, several countries, including the United States, have provided aid to these countries, especially to Colombia, but I think they need more. Otherwise, this is going to create other problems inside these countries, and they might change their views about what's happening in Venezuela or not. And also, it can create more problems inside these countries between groups that might not welcome refugees. Foreigners in their countries. It might create some xenophobia inside Latin American countries. So I think the international community should step in and help assist these host countries.
Very important point, Astrid. Thank you. That's I think when we talk about the Venezuela, we talk about the political situation, I think it's always critical that we think about the everyday Venezuelan that is suffering tremendously because of the regime, not only because of the political persecution, but the hyperinflation, the food shortages, the medical shortages, the malaria, everything that has come back and now coming across the hemisphere. Brian, that's actually something I'd be remiss if I didn't plug work that the Atlantic Council and FIU have done together, actually with Foreign Policy magazine, sorry, American Interest, where we played out scenarios of state collapse in Venezuela. And did this through what we called, rather than a war game, we called it a peace game a couple months ago. And had different folks playing different actors and how different actors could respond in the scenario of state collapse and the ramifications both domestically as well as externally. What is the singular, from that exercise, what do you see as the singular item in which audience members and those watching via live stream should be concerned about around this potential and I think very real possibility of state collapse, which could happen with Nicolas Maduro in power, which could happen with a transitional government, which could happen with Juan Guaidó in power. What's your biggest concern there?
No, it was an exceptional exercise, thought exercise that, grateful to the Atlantic Council for pulling together such an amazing group of people to talk about this. And, I played the role of China in the simulation, and, no surprise there. I found it really fascinating the role that China plays in the long term simply because of, sort of the equity they've been able to carve out in Venezuela over the long time, irregardless of some of the, sort of day-to-day politics that's going on in the country. I guess, the biggest takeaway I took, sort of the biggest takeaway for me in terms of worst-case scenario is that, in Venezuela today, you have some type of structure, and there's some authority vested in that structure. A total collapse in which you lose the authority and to sort of total structure of the state. You're now talking about an environment in which you have, no shortage of corrupt public officials, drug trafficking organizations, paramilitary groups, ELN, still resemblance of the FARC on the border, colectivos in militia, and then sort of the general criminal activity going on across the country. You're talking about a very, violent place. And I think, as we thought that out and we started to see some of, what could be the realities, it became a very serious future. And so, for me in this process, the state collapse becomes probably, the worst case scenario. These organizations will still have some, some structure, but there's no authority vested in that structure. And I think that out of that exercise was probably, one of the most grave, grave concerns.
Brian, just a follow-up question for you, separate from this exercise, but you bring up the important point of state structure and how that structure functions. And I'd be remiss, and we have just a couple more minutes before we're going to go to question and answer. So I was going to say, start thinking about your questions, but I'm sure all of you have already thought about your questions. So just get prepared to start to ask those questions. But Brian, we haven't talked yet about the military. And, I think of April 30th, my birthday, when we hope to see a large military uprising in support of the interim government, some military across the border, a few hundred, relatively low level, but we haven't seen the military break.
Right.
One of the conclusions around that is because the military is supported by and benefits from all the illegal activities that occur in Venezuela: drug trafficking, armed trafficking, human trafficking, gold trafficking. Yesterday, interim President Guaido called on the European Union to label as blood gold all that gold that's extracted from Venezuela. Why, or actually, how do you get the military to break? What's the key?
How much time do you have? No.
We got about 2 minutes before questions.
No, but this has been the central question for us, because at the end of the day, I think the military institution, sort of holds the keys to continuity and change in Venezuela. And one of the things that Chavez initiated was a purging of the military institution, especially in sort of the post-2002 period, and intentionally coup-proofing the institution by also fracturing the branches of the armed forces. But it was very smart in tying the survival of the regime to the survival, of senior military leadership in the military. And so now you're talking about senior military leadership engaged in corruption, by the way, down the ranks, engaged in corruption, engaged in illicit trafficking. And so, they're vested in Maduro's survival. And I think we know that. That's been part of the conventional wisdom. I think the one thing that's not been talked about enough is that, keep in mind, you're also talking about a military institution that's very distrustful of the opposition too. And so if your alternative to the regime is the opposition, well, I'm not sure you're compelling a lot of the senior military to want to jump ship. And despite, you throw, and we talked about this, you throw the idea of, amnesty to the military leadership. And military leadership is responding, saying, well, the Argentine generals had amnesty too before Kirchner came in. And so I don't think there has been enough incentives to move the right, military leadership away from the regime. And so, the military's been hedging. If they wait too long and there is some massive transformation, well, then those military leaders that decided not to break are going to find themselves in exile, in jail, in the ground. One of the three. If you, and that's sort of one, so that's the window they're looking for. If you jump too early and the regime doesn't fall, well, then, those three options are still on the table. And so you're talking about a military institution that has been, is kind of been stuck in this place, and it's intentional. It's a design, I think, that, the Cubans, which is very different, right? The Cuban military was the revolution, so it's slightly different, but nonetheless, that control over the institution becomes vital to the survival of the regime.
And perhaps also an important PR opportunity was missed on April 30th when those military, when soldiers did defect and come over to Colombia, and rather than being greeted with bottles of champagne and treated to lavish dinners and putting those images back in.
Jason, I think that's a good point. The National Guard particularly was out in front on that, and I happened to be in Washington on May 1st to give a talk on the Venezuelan military. And I remember, I think President Rosenberg was the first to send me a text message in the morning saying, "Are you watching what's going on with the video, rolling out of Guaido in the some fracturing in the military?" I think that was also a very, a missed opportunity. The fact that Guaido came out with Leopoldo Lopez off of his left shoulder, I think, changed some of the branding of Guaido's movement. But clearly you didn't have the kind of fracturing across the institution that you were hoping for.
Well, I'm sure we could keep talking on the panel, but I look at the microphones, and we have a long queue at each microphone. So let me get questions from the audience. We'll start on my left here, and I'll take a couple questions together, and then we'll respond to them as a panel. Please go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Sebastian. I'm a student here in FIU. Soy venezolano. I was born in Venezuela, came here in 2002. I want to see Maduro out of power. He has destroyed my country along with Chavez. My family suffers in Venezuela, those who remain there. But there are concerns among a lot of my peers about America's history in Latin America, thinking about things like our involvement in Honduras, Operation Condor, the extra-legal trafficking of arms to Contras. So among these things, so Mr. Abrams, this question for you. How does the administration expect to convince the public, both here and in Venezuela, that our intentions in resolving this issue are in good faith?
Thanks for your question. I'm going to take a couple questions together, and we'll go back to the panel. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kimberly Villamizar. I'm a student here, and I'm Colombian and Venezuelan, actually, where the convoys were burned. That's where my family's from. So, interesting enough, I was able to see the bridge just a couple months ago. I was interested in two things. I know that sending those trucks were trying to test the waters, see how aid can get through, but I wanted to know where did the $1 million of aid go? Where was it allocated to? I'm sure, of course, that it was. And the second question is Congresswoman Omar and a lot of people speculated who burned the trucks. So I just wanted to know how united is the government with helping Venezuela, because some people say hands off, which I understand is similar to what he was saying about how the U.S. intervenes or you know, in other countries. So I was just interested in how united is the U.S. government in helping, what percentage is interested, what percentage knows what's going on, is informed, and that's my question. Thank you, and thank you for coming.
Great, thank you. If you don't mind, I'm going to take one more question on this side, and I'll recap these questions.
Hi, my name is Felipe. I'm a first-year student here at FIU, and my question is that there have been reports about U.S. sanctions causing tens of thousands of deaths in Venezuela, specifically U.S. sanctions, and the topic of the day was sanctions here. We talked about it a lot. So I was wondering, how are we going to convince Venezuela to come to the negotiation table, considering the fact that if we impose more sanctions and bring about these more sanctions, there's just going to be possibly more deaths. So is that the cost to bring Maduro to the table, is to have, you know, more deaths of Venezuelan people? So,
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll address these questions. So how do we convince the public that the intentions are in good faith? Question about the assistance, and specifically around the humanitarian attempts in February of last year. And then how do we also convince the Maduro regime to come to the table and the consequences of sanctions?
Well, on the first one, let me just say, what's striking is this is not a situation where the U.S. is isolated. The Maduro regime is largely isolated. They've got a few big dictatorships on their side. Just really every democracy in Latin America and in Europe takes the same position as the U.S. with respect to Venezuela. So the question really isn't about U.S. intent. It's the intent of just about every democracy in the world. And what is it we want? We want an election. And I would remind you, when I've reminded many Chavistas over time, even some people in this regime, what did the United States do when the FMLN won a free election? We said, congratulations. We didn't suspend the aid program. What did we do when the FSLN won a free election the first time? We said, congratulations. So we do the same thing with the Chavistas. We just did it with the Peronistas. Our policy goal is a free election so that the Venezuelan people can do something they cannot today do, which is decide who should govern.
And the question on the U.S. assistance. And
yeah, a very small portion of that aid was perishable, but the vast bulk of it was either distributed to Venezuelan refugees in Colombia or actually we were able to get a good percentage of it into Venezuela through other Latin American countries. And it actually did end up in Venezuela.
Brian.
No, so I mean, on the question, if you were going to go to the question on U.S. Support for policy, I think there are enough issues that are dividing the U.S. government right now. This is one of the issues I tend to see more broad support in terms of bipartisan support, particularly as it comes down to the humanitarian crisis. I think there's very broad bipartisan support that something needs to be done. Maybe some distinctions within across the U.S. government in terms of how to get there. But if you were sort of to rack the Venezuela issue, which to your point, and by the way, I empathize with you and your family back in Venezuela, but on the point about whether or not most Americans really understand the Venezuela problem set, that's probably no. And it's not necessarily a major consideration for many politicians either across the United States. But there is a bipartisan show of support, in my opinion, with just a few outliers in the ones that you referenced.
Especially bipartisan support, I think, here in Florida, too, right? We've seen
especially here in Florida.
It's true, but it's broader. I really agree with you, and I would ask you to take a look at the statement in December by Elizabeth Warren about Venezuela. Fairly lengthy statement. And the statement, I think it was a tweet on Sunday or Monday by Pete Buttigieg. Totally supportive of where U.S. and EU policy are today.
Frank.
Yeah, I want to address the question from the student who, I think it was a student, about the sanctions, and he talked about the humanitarian disaster. And the first thing it's important is that the humanitarian disaster, the conditions in Venezuela are to blame, the government is to blame for that situation, basically. It is their corruption, mismanagement, et cetera. That is the bottom line for the humanitarian disaster, which only will get likely worse in Venezuela. However, to the point on sanctions, I think we are now going beyond just targeting individuals, and we are targeting larger sectors of the Venezuelan economy that's just having an effect on the Venezuelan people. So my question and sort of back and forth that I had with Elliott is sort of what is the objective of those sanctions? Theoretically, the theory of the case is if I apply sufficient sanctions on the Venezuelan economy and therefore the people, that will then result in the people beginning to blame or put more pressure on the government. And I think we've gone beyond that point. I don't see that more sanctions on the regime will lead to the regime finally deciding they want to negotiate, because it's been said here, the Cubans are not going to let the Venezuelans negotiate an exit to this.
Yeah, Frank,
so the theory of the case is, to me, confusing. It's, as a friend said to me, sanctions are to this administration what Vicks Vapor Rub is to Cuban abuelas. It's an all-purpose remedy that you keep putting on, making think that it's going to feel better, but it doesn't result in the outcome you want if you're so focused on that particular tool.
I'm going to give Special Representative a chance to respond, and then I want to turn it back to the students.
That's not the purpose of sanctions. That's completely wrong. The notion that we'll starve people out so that then they'll rise up. First of all, it would be an immoral policy, and it also wouldn't work. The purpose of sanctions is to deny resources to the regime. When the regime sells oil, it takes the money. Does it spend the money on the Venezuelan people? No. You can go back, as you said, go back 20 years. Go back to the years in which they were exporting 3 million barrels a day, and sometimes at $100 a barrel. Did that money go to the Venezuelan people? No. I mean, they have ruined the economy of the country. We're trying to prevent the regime from getting more resources with which it does what? It oppresses the people, and it fattens bank accounts in Zurich. That's what it does. All these guys have tons and tons of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. Intelligence community estimates that the amount of money stolen in the Chavez and Maduro regimes, and now overseas, is $200 billion. That would feed a lot of people in Venezuela. But they don't care about that. In June and July, we indicted, that is, the Department of Justice indicted actually some people in Maduro's family for stealing $300 million from the CLAP program. That's got nothing to do with U.S. sanctions. That is the Feed the Poor program. And they stole money from the program to feed the poor. That's the regime we're dealing with here. That's why we're trying to deny them the resources to continue to behave in this way. That's the purpose of sanctions. And the figure about, 10,000 people died because of sanctions is simply a made-up figure that the regime invented.
I want to go back to, we can continue the discussion here, but I want to go back to the students, please.
Hi, my name is Prachil Alwani. I am part of the Model of United Nations team here at FIU. I'm Venezuelan. I came here 2 years ago. I suffer a lot. But I have a simple question is, as we look at side actors continue present within Venezuela and Latin America, such as Russia and China, my question is, what U.S. actions will be most successful in pushing back on their influence? Do we think in diplomatic approaches, economic, intelligence, military? That is my question. Thank you so much for being here.
All right, thank you. And David, do I have time to go for a couple more questions here?
Yeah, take more.
Okay, one more over here.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kramer, for this excellent panel. It is quite an honor being here. I have a question. How can we guarantee that fair and free elections in Venezuela can give us a democratic transition? That's one question. And the second one is, if we have a transition, how do you see the foreign oil investments in Venezuela, since Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the hemisphere or in the world? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for those last questions. President Solis.
Yeah, I would like to address your question about the options. I think that the options are diplomatic. There's no other option. No. I mean, and when I say diplomatic, it's a full array of diplomatic, economic, sanctions, dialogues, cooperation. I do not see at this moment any possibility of a military option that would be supported by the international community, nor in the United States at a year when the United States is going to have elections. And I'm not saying any secrets. I mean, Maduro is seeing that too, and the regime, and it's the experience in the United States. I mean, we've had a long relationship with the United States, and largely we can see the forces that are operating. There's an impeachment on the way that's going to be discussed in the Senate, and there is the election campaign. There will be, a very complex electoral moment, and I think we have to think diplomatic, and I think we are thinking diplomatically, and I think there is a consensus that there are a number of options that are still there to be analyzed. And that includes the idea of dialogues that have not been made and performed, that maybe should be undertaken. And I'm not going to say with whom, but everybody knows what I'm talking about. I mean, we have to open dialogues with, the major parties here. Mr. Elliott has had important conversations with the Russians already in Rome a number of months ago. Well, there are other actors that need to be brought or are already being contacted. So my impression is that we have to think in that logic for the time being, not consider other things, and this also includes not getting the military back as fundamental decision makers in this. We've seen, it took us decades to get them out of Latin American politics, creating trouble, to bring them in now, thinking that they will bring back democracy. That's not the way it operates. They should follow, they should not lead on this matter.
President Solis, I think, I know others want to jump in on that, but I see David on the steps here, so I think that's going to be the last word. I want to thank this panel. I said from the outset that one of my goals in panels is always to have people not always agree with each other. I think we achieved that, and we also achieved, I think, providing incredible insight into the situation in Venezuela, and also, more importantly, ideas on the perspective moving forward of what could happen next. Also, how do we come up with those solutions? So, thanks to all of you for being here today.
Thank you.
Great job. Thank you very much to the panel, and an early happy birthday to Jason for April 30. We're going to transition now so the panel can go back there.